There's a kind of tired that does not show up on any medical test. It does not have a name that doctors write on forms. It is not the tiredness that comes from working too hard or sleeping too little. It is something older than that, something quieter. And if you have ever looked at a young person, someone in their early 20s, someone who by every external measure should be at the beginning of their life, and noticed something behind their eyes that looked like exhaustion, you were not imagining it. This is the story of Generation Z, born between 1997 and 2012, the first generation to grow up with the internet not as a novelty, but as the air they breathed. The first generation to carry a world of information and a world of comparison in their pocket before they were old enough to understand what that weight would cost them. And here's what nobody is saying out loud. They are exhausted in a way that the generations before them were not prepared for. Not because they are weak, but because they were handed something no human nervous system was ever designed to carry. Let us start at the beginning. When psychologists study childhood development, there's a concept they return to again and again, the idea of a regulated environment. A child needs to feel safe, not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. They need to know that the world outside is manageable, that the adults around them have things under control, that there is a tomorrow, and it will look something like today. Generation Z grew up without that certainty. By the time the oldest members of Gen Z were entering middle school, the 2008 financial crisis had already begun reshaping their families. They watched parents lose jobs, lose homes, lose the quiet confidence that had defined earlier decades. They absorbed that anxiety the way children always do, not through words, but through atmosphere. Through the tension at dinner tables, through conversations that stopped when they walked into the room. And then came the phones, not as tools, as worlds, as alternate realities that were always open, always on, always watching. By the time Gen Z reached adolescence, social media was not something you visited, it was something you lived inside. And living inside it meant something very specific. It meant that the social dynamics that had always existed in school hallways, the hierarchies, the comparisons, the cruelty that teenagers have always carried, now followed them home, into their bedrooms, into the moments that used to be safe. There was no off switch. There was no leaving it at school. The social world of Gen Z became a continuous, unbroken stream, and the human brain, which evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to manage the social dynamics of a small tribe, was suddenly being asked to process more than it can regulate. Psychologists have a term for what happens when the nervous system is asked to process more than it can regulate. They call it chronic low-grade stress activation. The body stays slightly tense. The mind stays slightly alert, not in full crisis mode, not in obvious distress, just on, always slightly watching for the next thing to respond to. This is the invisible tax that Gen Z has been paying since childhood, and over years, that tax accumulates. But here's what makes the exhaustion of Gen Z different from anything the generations before them experienced. It's not just the quantity of stress, it's the nature of it. Every previous generation had problems they could point to. The economy, a war, a specific social injustice they could name and organize around. The struggle was visible. It had edges. You could look at it directly. Gen Z's struggle does not have edges. They grew up with climate anxiety, not as a political opinion, but as a background hum, a low-level awareness absorbed from headlines and conversations and algorithms that the planet itself might not be stable in the way their grandparents assumed it would be. They grew up with political polarization so extreme that the concept of shared reality began to feel like a relic. They watched all of this while being simultaneously told that they were the most educated, most connected, most opportunity-rich generation in human history. while being told that if they worked hard and believed in themselves, the world was theirs. The distance between that message and their actual experience created something psychologists now recognize as a specific form of psychological exhaustion, the exhaustion of cognitive dissonance held for too long, the exhaustion of being told everything is fine when your nervous system is telling you something different. And so they adapted, the way humans always adapt to environments that ask too much of them. Some of them became hyper-productive, throwing themselves into work and achievement with an intensity that looked like ambition, but was really a form of control. If I can just accomplish enough, maybe the anxiety will quiet. Some of them withdrew, not dramatically, not in ways that looked like crisis, but quietly. Fewer relationships, smaller worlds. The social batteries that social media had drained, leaving very little left for the real, slower, more demanding work of human connection. Some of them became fluent in the language of mental health, not because therapy culture had made them weak, as an older generation sometimes assumed, but because naming the thing was the only tool they had been given. If I can describe what is happening to me precisely enough, maybe I can manage it. And all of them, in some form, in some measure, learned to perform being fine. This is perhaps the most quietly devastating thing about the psychology of Generation Z. Not the anxiety itself, not the exhaustion itself, but the performance layered on top of it. The curated feed, the filtered image, the version of themselves they learned to present to a world that was always watching, always comparing, always ready to respond. Behind every carefully composed photo is a person who's been managing their own presentation since before they were old enough to drive. Behind every confident online persona is someone who learned very early that vulnerability was not safe, not in the real world, and certainly not in the digital one. And this is where the exhaustion goes deepest, because maintaining a performance is work. Constant, invisible, unacknowledged work. The kind that does not show up in any productivity metric. The kind that nobody gives you credit for. The kind that follows you to bed at night and is waiting for you when you wake up. Generation Z did not choose this. They were born into it. And they have been carrying it quietly, competently, mostly alone for their entire conscious lives. There is a name for what happens when a person spends years managing more than their nervous system was designed to manage. When the gap between the self they show the world and the self they actually inhabit grows too wide. When the background hum of anxiety becomes so constant that silence itself begins to feel suspicious. Psychologists call it emotional depletion. But if you ask a member of Generation Z to describe it, they will probably use a simpler word. They will say they are tired. And what they mean, what they are trying to tell us in the only language exhaustion leaves room for, is something much larger than tired. Something that started before they were old enough to understand it. Something that has been accumulating quietly in the space between who they were told they could be and what the world actually asked of them. To understand where that exhaustion leads, and more importantly, what it means, we need to go deeper. Because the story of Generation Z is not a story about weakness. It is not a story about a generation that failed to cope. It is a story about what happens when an entire generation is asked to carry the weight of a world in transition, and what that weight reveals about all of us. Here's the thing about exhaustion that nobody talks about. It is not just tiredness. It is not just the absence of energy. True exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones of a generation, is also a form of information. It is the nervous system communicating something that words have not yet caught up to. And what Gen Z's exhaustion is communicating, when you sit with it long enough to actually hear it, is this. The map we were given does not match the terrain. Every generation receives a map, a set of assumptions about how life works. You study hard, you build something, the world rewards effort with stability. You form relationships, they last. You find meaning in institutions, in work, in community, in faith, and those institutions hold. Gen Z received that map, and then they watched in real time as it stopped being accurate. The degrees that were supposed to open doors opened debt instead. The careers that were supposed to build towards something kept restructuring, downsizing, pivoting. The relationships that were supposed to anchor them were harder to form in a world where every connection was mediated through a screen that flattened depth into performance. The future that was supposed to be theirs kept feeling less certain, less solid, less like something they could actually reach for. And yet, and this is the part that matters, they kept going. This is the thing that gets missed in every conversation about Generation Z. The narrative tends to stop at the wound, at the anxiety, at the exhaustion, as if that is the whole story. It is not the whole story. Because here's what psychologists also know about chronic stress. It does not only deplete, it also, over time, teaches. The nervous system that has been asked to manage uncertainty for long enough begins to develop something that earlier generations with their more stable maps never quite had to build, a particular kind of resilience. Not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet kind, the kind that knows how to sit with not knowing and keep moving anyway. Gen Z did not get the certainty that their parents had, but they got something else. They got fluency in ambiguity. They got the ability to hold complexity, to understand that the world is not simple, that people are not simple, that the answer is rarely clean in a way that generations raised on cleaner narratives sometimes struggle to access. They got radical honesty, the willingness to name what is actually happening in their own minds, in the world around them, without the protective layer of optimism that earlier generations sometimes used to avoid difficult truths. They got each other, not in the ways that previous generations connected, not through the shared physical spaces of neighborhoods and workplaces and community halls, but through something stranger and in its own way more remarkable. The ability to find, across distances and borders and backgrounds, the specific people who understood exactly what they were carrying. The ones who were tired in the same way, the ones who grew up inside the same contradictions. There's a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. The idea that difficulty, when it is processed rather than simply survived, does not only leave damage, it also leaves capacity. It expands the range of what a person can hold. It deepens the quality of attention they bring to their own experience and to the experience of others. Generation Z is, collectively, in the middle of that process, not at the end of it, not having arrived somewhere clean and resolved, but in the middle, which is exactly where post-traumatic growth lives, in the uncertainty, in the not yet, in the space between the old map and the new one that has not quite been drawn yet. And this is where I want to speak directly to anyone in this generation who is listening. Your exhaustion is not a character flaw. It is not weakness dressed up as sensitivity. It is not evidence that you are failing at a life that other people seem to be managing just fine. Other people are not managing just fine. They are performing managing just fine. And you, of all generations, know the difference between a performance and the real thing. What you are tired from is real. The weight is real. The gap between what you were promised and what you actually inherited, that is real. And the fact that you have been carrying it with so little acknowledgement for so long, that matters. It deserves to be said out loud. But I also want you to hear this. The same nervous system that learned to live inside all of that uncertainty is the same nervous system that is going to build whatever comes next. The same generation that grew up without stable ground is also the generation most practiced at moving without it. The same people who learned young that institutions could fail them are also the people least likely to be destroyed when they do. You are not broken.
You are calibrated for a world that is still becoming itself. And that, even when it doesn't feel like it, even on the days when the tired goes all the way down, is not a small thing. The exhaustion is real, and so is everything it built in you. If something in this video felt true to your experience, if some part of what we explored today named something you've been carrying without quite having the words for, then this channel exists exactly for that. These conversations matter, and so do you.